Cool. So yeah, welcome back. Today we're talking about the end of regression and then kind of the transition or the linkage between regression and the statistical way of viewing regression and then the machine learning way of viewing regression. So let me type in the URLs. Yeah, so that should work. And then as a backup, GitHub. Cool. One of those two URLs I just posted in the chat should hopefully work. But yeah, for now, let me share screen. Cool. So yeah, evaluating and interpreting linear regression, to be specific. Cool. And that's the outline. We'll just talk about, everything here is like basically just what do you do with the results, the table of results that you get when you run a regression using stats models. And then everything down here is like essentially working towards, well, it's like a new way of thinking about regression, but then in practice, how to use scikit-learn instead of stats models. So cool. All right, so the first thing, last week we saw the table of results, and then in lecture this week, you've spent a bunch of time looking at, like what the different entries in the regression results table are. So now I'm going to talk about, I'm going to build on that. I'm going to assume that you already know that, because if you don't, it's in the lecture, basically like a bunch of the slides just have a picture of the regression output with little boxes on it, and it tells you where each of these things that I'm talking about is in the table. And so, yeah, the first thing is substantive versus significant effects. So yeah, everything here is just me reframing stuff from the lecture and the way that my brain thinks about it in case it helps you. So for this one, substantive and versus significant, it just boils down in my head to the difference between, is it interesting for society is substantive, right? Like if you were a policymaker, or if you were a person trying to administer a drug or anything like that, the substantiveness of the results would be the side of it that you care about, even though significance would be a necessary but not sufficient condition. Like if you're a policymaker, you care about significance as a baseline, but then also how substantive it is. That determines how much, just how the extent to which you think it will address a social something in society. So yeah, and then significant is just how much do we believe it, right? Significance is the statistical side of things, right? It's saying using the tools of statistics that we have at hand, what can we say about this finding that we just found through regression, right? Can we say do we actually believe it? That's, moving ahead, that's kind of the point of the p-value cutoffs in scientific journals, is how much do we if it's above a 5% chance that this could have happened, that this coefficient could have happened by chance or by random noise, then we don't really believe it as much as wow, this effect was very, very unlikely to happen by chance. So yeah, as an example, if the government carries out 2 studies, right? One finds that a means tested welfare program decreases poverty by 0.00001%, but it's significant at the 1% level of confidence. right? So that's very statistically significant. But the actual like magnitude of the effect, like the extent to which it would have an effect on society, it's low, right? And it's not, I mean, even decreasing poverty by this much is like a good thing, but compare it to like another study that finds a universal basic income program, right, which is just non-means tested welfare, decreases poverty by 10%, and that's significant. But that's only significant at the 10% level of confidence, right? Not the 5% or the 1%. So then, which one is more substantive, right? The given these like definitions, like the universal basic income study is more substantive because it's like, wow, that's a humongous effect that could like, you could cut poverty, you could literally decimate poverty, right? That's like the meaning of that word, decimate, cut down by 10%. Whereas which one is more significant, right? Statistical significance, this one is more significant because it's significant at the 1% level of confidence, right? So that's just an example of the trade-off. And these types of studies happen all the time. Like, I mean, like full disclosure, like I work for this organization, JFI, but I just like, it's one of the things that they're doing, and it's a citywide like guaranteed income initiative, and like it's a bunch of like social scientists, but they do like partnerships with cities and stuff to do like experiments with policy. In this case, it's in like Compton, California, so you can click on that to read about it. The point is like these studies like really do happen, and then when they get the findings, say like 5 years from now, of like how much the basic income program helped alleviate hunger or like evictions or just say like commute time to work, just all these types of quality of life things. They'll need to know, like they'll get a level of statistical significance, but they'll also need to judge how substantive it is. Yeah.
Hi, Jeff, just a question, because the professor said p-value is basically the likelihood we get results as extreme as the one we're getting from the experiment. Are they referring to null hypothesis or alternative hypothesis?
Right. So the as extreme language, that's the language for a two-tailed test, just to like be really clear of what we're talking about. So as extreme would be like, so in this case, right, we would be, the null hypothesis would be like, so let's say like this basic income study. The null hypothesis is like basic income doesn't have any effect on, let's say, hunger rates, right? Meaning like maybe when you give people basic income, by the way, that just means like you send them a check, kind of like the COVID check, right? Basic income just means you don't like test, you don't like give different amounts to different people, you just send everyone a certain amount. So the null hypothesis there could be implementing a basic income program has no effect on hunger, right? Like you send them the check, but then they just have to pay their debts with it, and they're not less hungry. Whereas the alternative hypothesis could be like it does have an effect. So the alternative hypothesis, if you wanted to perform a two-tailed test, would be a little weird because it would say a universal basic income program has an effect, right? But actually in the two-tailed test, you don't specify the direction of the effect. So it could be that the universal basic income decreases hunger a lot, right? Which is what we would want. Or it could be that the universal basic income increases hunger a lot, right? And so that test that you're talking about, the two-tailed test, those would be the null and alternative hypotheses, meaning like if hunger went up a ton or if hunger went down a ton, either of those would be evidence for the alternative hypothesis, right? If you were performing a one-tailed test, which is probably what you'd want to perform here, the one-tailed test is about cares about like what direction away from zero the effect is, right? So we'd probably want to do a one-tailed test, and we'd want to say null hypothesis. Well, okay, there we'd want to start with the alternative hypothesis first. So there, the alternative hypothesis would be that universal basic income decreases hunger rates, right? Or decreases poverty here. I should have said poverty this whole time, but yeah, decreases poverty, whereas the null hypothesis is the opposite, so that it doesn't decrease poverty, right? that means it either doesn't do anything to poverty or it increases poverty, right? So it just depends on whether you're performing a two-tailed or one-tailed test.
Okay, I see. So in this case, if we have like a 0.5% level of confidence, we will reject null hypothesis and saying that,
Yep.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. And like, depending on which one of those two tests, like no matter what, the 0.05 that p-value cutoff that you're talking about, that's evidence that you reject the null hypothesis, that you feel comfortable rejecting the null hypothesis at that confidence level. But then what that means, right? Like which thing is the null hypothesis and which thing is the alternative hypothesis? That just depends on like the study. Like as the person planning the experiment, you would pick which one of the, like in this case, right? We actually want to like decrease poverty. So that's like a one-tailed test because it's only one direction that we care about. But maybe we're just like, maybe we don't know what's going to happen. Like maybe, yeah, it's more like in biology or let's say like chemistry or something like that. It's like, okay, we just like put this molecule, yeah, and we just like inject, we just drop some chemical into an ecosystem, right? Maybe we don't actually know whether it will like increase population growth rates or decrease them. Like we just don't know. In that case, a two-tailed test makes more sense because then it's just like either the chemical affects the population growth rate in some way, but we don't know which direction, but that our hypothesis is just that it does have some effect or it doesn't have some effect, right? We don't know about, our hypothesis doesn't really, we're not interested yet in like the direction of the effect, right? Maybe you could do that study and you find, oh, yeah, it had an effect and it looks like it's positive. Then you could perform another test, another one-tailed test that says, okay, now my alternative hypothesis is that introducing this chemical increases population rate. But yeah, and it's just about whether you care about the direction or not. So in this case, like decreases is a keyword because that means we do care the direction in which it affects the dependent variable. And yeah, in all this, like since I put, this guaranteed, this basic income study, I just wanted to emphasize, like underline this slide from lecture, which is that, yeah, you really should be justifying your measures. Like anytime you're like doing any sort of study, this right here, this box right here, like makes me very happy because the comparison of different regime measures. Yeah, like, oh, I wish it's in a book over there somewhere, but there's this, like my favorite types of, not just my favorite, but like the types of social science studies that I think are most valuable are ones that have sections like this, where they say, okay, here's me explaining like why I picked this as my dependent variable and why I picked this as my independent variable, right? Because even this like poverty, right? That's, you could read whole books, there are whole classes in development economics, right? On how to measure poverty, like the different ways to measure poverty. So yeah, that was just kind of like a plea to underline this slide from lecture. And it's like why we chose polity as the main source for democracy measures as opposed to other ones. So yeah, now p-values, going back to your question. In theory, it's the probability of getting the coefficient that we got in our regression if the null hypothesis is correct, it's true, right? So when you're doing a regression, yeah, the null hypothesis is almost always, pretty much always, I've like never seen it not this, that the coefficient of interest is 0, right? So if you think about it, that means in regression, you're pretty much always doing a two-tailed test, right? Because like if the null hypothesis is that it's 0, then the alternative hypothesis could be it's way less than 0 or it's bigger than 0, right? So like when you run stats models, when you do a regression and it gives you that p-value, just remember that that's a two-tailed p-value, right? You have to like give it a special command if you want it to do a one-tailed value. By default, it just does two-tailed, right? Which is that the coefficient is 0 or the coefficient is not 0 is the alternative hypothesis, but we don't know whether it's less than 0 or greater than 0. Alternative hypothesis is just that it's not 0. So given that that's like the default null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis for regressions, then the p-value is the probability that we would get the observed coefficient, right? The coefficient that we got in the regression results table, if the true coefficient is 0, right? So like the lower that the p-value is, right? The smaller the p-value is, the more we believe that the effect we found was real, that it's not 0, and that this coefficient actually, like, if the coefficient's positive, then we believe that there is a positive effect. And if the coefficient is negative, then we believe in the negative effect, right? We believe it more and more, the smaller and smaller the p-value is. This is all in theory, like mathematically, given a bunch of assumptions, right? But the problem is that in practice, there's just too many moving parts in experiments, and especially in observational studies, which is like all of social science basically, for this to be that meaningful, right? Because like I said, all this stuff up here is like true under like mathematical assumptions that everything is controlled besides like the independent and the dependent variable, right? But in the real world, there's a bunch of stuff that we can't control, even just stuff like the mood of like people taking our surveys or whatever, right? And so I just like threw this in, even though it's not in the class, just for like 30 seconds, because it feels irresponsible to just teach the p-value without this, right? That like since the 80s, since like powerful computers became widely available, like you didn't, like the computers that we have right now, the phone that you're looking at this on or whatever is like more powerful than gigantic supercomputers from like the 80s, right? So yeah, Bayesian statistics is just this approach that like has more stuff that you need to calculate than just like the p-value. But since we have computers, we don't care that it's a bunch of stuff to calculate because the computer just does it for us in like half a second, right? And so, for example, like just to tell you what that means, like what this Bayesian stuff means, like if 1 million experiments up till now found the gravitational constant to be this that I Googled, but then we do an experiment and we find an estimate of 3, say we just get 3, not like this tiny number, but just 3. And yet it's like statistically significant. The Bayesian approach allows us to say like, well, if 1 million experiments got this number and then 1 experiment got this number, we can like, even though this experiment did find this 3 as statistically significant, we can still like downweight it because Bayesian allows us to incorporate like prior knowledge, right? So it sounds like, I won't go on like a tangent, but it sounds subjective because you're like, oh, but how do you incorporate the prior knowledge? But actually like, it's actually more helpful because it helps you to correct, right? Because weird things can happen in experiments. Like you can perform an experiment and get just like a totally wrong value because of something weird about the way you set up the experiment, for example. And so in frequentism, you would just get like 3 and you'd be like, all right, well, it's like statistically significant. So I guess the gravitational constant is suddenly 3, right? But Bayesian allows you to say like, it's unlikely, right? You kind of weigh the current experiment with like all the past data that you have about the thing that you're looking at. So yeah, there's a whole article I linked to here about that. And those are called, yeah, prior information. Bayesian statistics allows you to incorporate prior information so that it's your result doesn't get biased by some weird thing that you might have messed up in the experiment, right? Cool. So going back, yeah, in this class for like diagnosing or like evaluating your OLS, ordinary least squares regression results, we focused on these 4 values, and I'll just go through them really quickly and kind of, yeah, talk about how much you should care about them. So R squared is in theory, again, mathematically something, it says like the proportion of variance in the dependent variable that's explained by the independent variable. But yeah, explained by is a really loaded term because like if you look up the math of what explained by means, it's not really like how humans would talk about explaining variance in the dependent variable. It just kind of means like, how do I put it? Yeah, I mean, R squared is just basically like a measure of how well the dots, the data points fit on like a line, right? So, but you saw in, I think a couple lectures ago, Anscombe's quartet, which is like a bunch of different plots of data that look like very different processes, like very different patterns, and yet they all had like the same mean and variance and R-squared value. So R-squared is kind of, yeah, I would just think of it like a regression specific correlation measure and not something about like explaining the dependent variable. It's just not really that, even though that's like the textbook definition they'll give you. Adjusted R-squared is like a little better because, as we'll see when we go to machine learning, this will become big at the end of these slides. Like you can always just include more and more variables in a regression model and get better and better explanation of the dependent variable, right? Like it can't go down is the point. Meaning, if you add a new variable and it doesn't give us any information about the dependent variable, the regression analysis just won't use it. It'll just throw it out basically. And so it doesn't, your R-squared can't go down by adding more variables. It can only go up. So adjusted R-squared is a little better because it just says it penalizes you for doing that, right? Otherwise, like you could just go into a science lab and just measure like a billion trillion things, like as many possible things as you could, and just throw them all in the regression and get like really high R-squared values, right? And that's not because it's actually like explaining, you know, the variance in the dependent variable. It's just because like it has to do with overfitting, which we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. But long story short, is because the computer is basically seeing patterns in, you know, these millions of variables that you've included with the dependent variable, right? Correlation patterns that aren't really like there. They're just, you're just like, if you throw enough variables in, you'll get lucky about like, oh wow, this variable has a high correlation, right? Remember the like Nicolas Cage movies and like drownings type data, right? You just combine enough variables and eventually you'll find some high correlations and that'll give you a really high R-squared. But adjusted R-squared penalizes you for trying a bunch of different variables. The F statistic, the good way to remember this one is just that it's like a p-value, but for the whole model, for all the coefficients, right? Not just the one coefficient, right? So p-value is like how significant is this coefficient, right? But the F statistic is like how significant is this whole model? Meaning like the null hypothesis. The easy way to remember it also is that in the F statistic, the null hypothesis is that all the coefficients are 0, right? So like if you have 5 independent variables, the F statistic is that the coefficient on the first one is 0, and the coefficient on the second one is 0, and the coefficient on the third one is 0, fourth one is 0, and fifth one is 0, right? So then that's the null hypothesis. So then the alternative, if you think about it, if you take like logic and I guess you do De Morgan's law is the name for that, negating an and, you get that the alternative hypothesis is pretty lenient. It's like either the first one is not 0, or the second one is not 0, or the third one is not 0, or the fourth one is not 0, or the fifth one is not 0, or some combination, right? Maybe first and second one are not 0. As long as at least one of them is not 0, that's the alternative hypothesis for the F statistic. So it's like a really, you know, it's like easy to pass, but it can be helpful for like if you have, it'll tell you if they have like a really bad model where it's like, dude, none of these variables seem to be related to the dependent variable, right? None of these independent variables seem to be related to the variable that you want to explain. And then confidence intervals are kind of like R-squared, where you want to be very careful using them because they're not really what you think at all. They're like not what you think at all. Like if you remember one thing about confidence intervals, just remember that they're not intervals that tell us how confident we are in our result. So it's like they tell us the official definition, and like it's so like I've been doing, like I have a degree in stats, everything. Like, I've been doing it for like a decade, and I can't. Confidence intervals just don't make sense to me personally. It technically is if we conduct our study many times, 95% of the time out of those times that we conduct our study, like say we conduct our study like, in fact, we can't even sorry, we can't even say if we conduct our study like 1,000 times, 95% of the time, our confidence interval will contain the true coefficient. That's not true. It's many, many times, meaning going to infinity. Meaning if we conduct our study like many, many times out to infinity, as we get closer and closer to infinity, which is never, you never get closer to infinity, but like as the number goes up and up and up and up, on average, it becomes that 95% of the time, the confidence interval that shows in our regression output, you can see it in the table of coefficients, will capture the true coefficient. It does not say that we are 95% confident our coefficient is within this range. So I don't get why this is like useful to anyone, and neither do most like competent statisticians that I know. Like they won't talk about confidence intervals. There's a related thing in Bayesian statistics called I think it's called like a coherence interval or something like that. Said it's on video and I can't remember because I'm supposed to be a Bayesian person, but if you see the Gelman article that I linked to before, he talks about it. So like keep the idea of like confidence intervals in your head as like it is a thing. Just in the confidence intervals that we learn in this class, the confidence intervals that you read off a regression table are not the thing that you want it to be. The Bayesian confidence interval is like there's a 95% chance that the true coefficient is in this interval. Like that's dope. That's like what we want as statisticians, right? We want to say like, oh, I can say with 95, I am 95% confident. Like I would bet a lot of money that the true coefficient is in this interval. Bayesian statistics gives you that. This class is frequentist statistics. Frequentist confidence intervals don't give you that. It's kind of a mess. It's kind of like, anyway, but we have to learn it because like, so that you don't look at the regression table and get confused. Like you look at the regression table, you see the confidence interval and it's this. We conduct the study a bunch of times. 95% of the time, the confidence interval will contain the true coefficient, but you can't draw any inferences like this from that. It's weird because statistics is weird. Well, frequentist, yeah. So yeah, I've actually been like talking about it since, for example, like the F statistic refers explicitly to models with more than one independent variable, but yeah, you can have more than one independent variable, and it's called multiple regression, right? And so all that happens is you still have a beta 0 coefficient for the intercept, and then, sorry, you still have beta 1, right? But now, I know this looks confusing, but I just want to explain like what these little subscripts mean. So now instead of just xi, meaning like, oh, the independent variable for person I, now we have x1i, which means the first independent variable for person I. And x2i is the second like independent variable, the second piece of information about person I, ... up to n, right? So as many variables as you want. And I should have included the error term here. You still have that epsilon sub I, but like meaning you should look at this and it should remind you of the equation for standard single variable regression, just more of these beta things, right? And n of them instead of one. And now like this is kind of the trickiest part. Like it probably deserves more than one bullet point, but I couldn't think of much to say besides this, but just hopefully like maybe I should have bolded it or like highlighted it or something. But now the coefficient interpretation changes. When you had a single variable regression, like we've done a bunch of times now, that's like an increase. In the single variable case, it's just an increase in my independent variable is associated with beta change in my dependent variable, right? So if beta is like 5, that means that a 1 unit increase in my independent variable is associated with a 5 unit increase in my dependent variable. But now that we have multiple variables, it becomes trickier. And like this really trips up a lot of people because they just do the thing I just said, which is the interpretation of the coefficient when it's just one variable, and they just assume it's the same for the multiple regression, but it's not. There's this additional bolded thing here, which is that now when we look at these betas that we estimate, it's the interpretation is an increase of 1 unit in that independent variable, right? So beta 1 if we're looking at beta 1, we're talking about the first independent variable. If we're looking at beta 2, we're talking about the second one, and so on. An increase of 1 unit in that independent variable is associated with an increase of the beta variable units in y, the dependent variable. So far everything's the same as for a single variable, but we add when all other variables are held constant. I could, like in office hours or something, if that's confusing, there's like a deeper way of talking about what it means to hold variables constant. But for now, you can just, let me put it this way. The easier way to think about it is there's an option you can provide when you're doing regression, like in whatever package, to center the data. And you've actually learned that because when we compute z-scores, we're centering the data and then dividing by standard deviation. But if you don't divide by standard deviation and you just center it, I can explain the math behind this in office hours, but if you just center your data so that the mean is 0, then actually holding variables constant makes more sense, because if the data is centered, then you say an increase of 1 unit in xi is associated with an increase of bi units in the dependent variable when all other variables are at their mean. When the mean is, yeah. So like if say that you have 2 variables, right? Like, okay, say you're trying to predict, or say your dependent variable is poverty rate, right? And your first independent variable is age, and your second independent variable is income level. Then if you center your variables, which like you just should, so say you do that, then you can suddenly, it's nice because you can interpret the coefficient on age as like for a person at the average income level, being 1 more year old makes you this much more or less likely to be living in poverty, right? And then the reverse, if you're looking at the coefficient on income, you can say like $1 additional, sorry, you can say for a person at the average age, so whatever the average age is in that society, an additional $1 takes you this much out of poverty, right? So yeah, that's, I think, the most helpful thing. When you read when all other variables are held constant, just remember that if you center your data, which you should, it has that interpretation of like all the other things, just pretend it's the average. So, you have like 10 variables, all these like demographic information about someone, and you're trying to look at like, oh, how does their age affect their probability of living in poverty? Just think of all the other variables at their average value, right? So we're considering like the average person, but we're changing their age a little bit, or we're considering the average person, but we're changing their income a little bit. That's, I think, helpful to remember. Cool. So that's regression. And then in Wednesday, we moved kind of from, that's all been the statistical way of thinking about things, right? That's why I was talking about like frequentism and Bayesian statistics. Machine learning, again, is all based on Bayesian statistics, but Bayesian statistics for some reason just like isn't incorporated into high school or like undergraduate stats classes pretty much ever. Like you may learn Bayes' rule, but Bayes' rule, like don't get confused. Like Bayes' rule is a true statement, whether you're doing frequentist or Bayesian statistics. It's just like how you use Bayes' rule. So if you've heard Bayes' rule, just remember that. It's like, that's true no matter what type of statistics you're doing. It's just that Bayesian statistics uses it like more and in a more like involved way. So all that is just to say, yeah, machine learning, like if you go and you do a career in machine learning, like I guess I have, like all my papers and stuff, they're all in machine learning, right? It's all Bayesian. So I just want to like tuck that in the back of your head, that there's all these different statistical approaches to these things like regression and machine learning and all this. And we're learning, yeah, the frequentist way, but it won't hinder, like when you learn Bayesian, you'll be able to just kind of say, oh, okay. Like remember with the p-value slide that I was talking about, where it's like, okay, under frequentism, we get 3 for the gravitational constant. And we just go like, well, it's statistically significant, I guess. So I guess I got to believe it. Bayesianism, right? It lets you take in information from outside of that experiment and say, actually, that's not really likely, right? So that's an example where like you had to learn the frequentist thing first, right? You had to learn what it means for 3 to be statistically significant. And then Bayesian is kind of like it makes it more subtle, right? So that's all I'm saying about this. Statistics, right? What we care about is inference. So meaning like we care about, I probably should have drawn a little diagram of like the independent variable and then an arrow going to the dependent variable, because in statistics, the way I think of it is like we care about the linkage between these two variables, right? Like in statistical approach, and especially in social science, we care about like why does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? Like we care about that effect. Like how big is it? Is it positive or negative? Is it statistically significant? Things like that. Machine learning came out of prediction, right? Like in my field, at least, like there's different types of AI, but like in my field, and it's the most popular field, which is just like neural net based like machine learning stuff. Meaning if you took a machine learning class, most of the stuff you'd learn about would be like sort of, so let's call it like the standard machine learning approach. In that approach, it came out of like predicting, like one of the most famous data sets is the Postal Service in the US was trying to, they had a problem where it was like, it takes so much time and effort and energy and so many people to look at envelopes and like figure out what is written on them, right? Because people just write on the envelope and everyone's handwriting looks different, right? And so the most important thing when in like the US, when you write a letter is the zip code, right? So it's like a 5-digit zip code. And the Postal Service was like, we just have like 1 million people spending like 8 hours a day, all day, every day, just looking at these envelopes and trying to figure out what zip code is written. So then one of the biggest, like the first big thing that machine learning did, well, one of two, but this is like a big thing that made people millionaires, right? Is they wrote a machine learning algorithm that predicted, given like a picture of a digit that someone wrote on an envelope, it just predicts what the number is, right? That it sounds so like simple, but it turns out that's like the foundation of machine learning. It's called MNIST, M-N-I-S-T. If you wanted to like Google it, is the name for this project. And it turns out like, right, it saved the post office like tens of millions of dollars because now, I mean, it's the automation thing, it got rid of jobs, but yeah, now like they didn't need to pay like thousands of people their salaries. They just had a compute. You just put the envelope like into a machine. The machine takes a picture of the handwriting and it detects what the zip code is, right? And if you think about it, that's all about prediction. Like they don't care like why the they don't care like, oh, why did it think that this envelope said like 94305, right? They didn't care, like they don't really ask the machine like, wait, what was it? Like, was it a dot? Was there like, was it because like the ink was thicker over here than over here? Or was it because like, it's like, there's only one vertical line in it? Like they don't ask the computer why it predicted that, right? They just, it's like a black box. The point is like prediction. It's not about what it was about the independent variable, in this case, the handwritten digit, and the dependent variable. It's just about predicting. They don't care. They just want to predict the zip code and then send it there and then go on to the next one, right? And produce like millions of these in a day. So that's, I'm just like giving that as historical background because that's why like prediction just comes to the forefront, right? In statistics, people cared about why, like why does basic income decrease poverty, right? Like what is it? Like what are people using their basic income for? There they care about like the process by which the independent variable, right, like causes the dependent variable. But in machine learning, they just, the background is like they just didn't care. It was all about prediction, right? Another classic thing is like weather, right? Like a lot of people, they don't, like you look up, when you look up your weather forecast, you don't really care like why they think it's gonna rain tomorrow. I mean, maybe you do if you're like really curious, but most people, they just look at it and they're like, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow. And so for like a weather channel company, you just care about predicting the weather really well, right? So in that case, actually, they usually just throw in a ton of variables, and they get overfitting, the R-squared thing I was talking about, and we'll talk about that at the end. So yeah, what's going to happen next? The weather. Will people who do X also do Y? That's like Netflix when they recommend you stuff. They don't actually know why. Like, you might be like, Netflix, why did you recommend me this? Like, it doesn't seem like I would like this show. They can't actually tell you, right? Like, that's the weird thing about machine learning, right? We don't know why. We can't do the inference. We have no idea why the Netflix recommendation engine recommended this movie for you. It just did some really crazy complex algorithm, and it found, like, given the set of movies that this person has watched, we think they'll enjoy this one. It doesn't know why. I mean, we're starting to know why, but it's like kind of magical. Like, I'm not exaggerating. You can read articles about how much we don't understand machine learning algorithms and how they come up with their predictions. So yeah, that's, I think, just important to remember the history, because then you'll remember like how like blatantly statistics was about explaining things, because it came from like mostly like social science, like back in the day. Like, oh, well, it came from biology and social science. So in biology, they also cared about like the biological processes. Like, why does this person get this disease, right? We don't just want to predict that this person will get the disease or not. We want to know why they get the disease, because then we can look at other people and say like, oh, hey, you have the sign of the disease that we found in these studies. Whereas machine learning, no, you just plug in a person, predict whether they're going to get the disease or not, and you don't know why. You can't like transfer it to other things. So in practice, there's another difference, meaning that's the difference in like theory, is that one is about explanation or inference, whereas the other one is about prediction. But then in practice, there's just a different like methodology, right? So in statistical regression, basically what you've seen is that you just toss all the data into stats models and you observe the result. It's like a deterministic mathematical result, right? To the extent that like there's just an equation. Like, if you are an econ major, you take like econometrics, it's kind of funny. Like, you just learn it and you think that that's what regression is, even though regression is like this humongous thing. There's a million different types of regressions. Like, if you take econometrics, you technically will learn an equation that will tell you what the how to find all the coefficients. Like, you'll literally have an equation that's like beta, right? The beta from our equation before equals, I mean, it's x transpose x transpose x inverse x transpose y. It's like matrix multiplication stuff, but yeah, it's like an equation. Whereas in machine learning, there's never an equation. There's no like equation, right? Because it's these complicated algorithms, right? You can never, it doesn't boil down to an equation. It's like this highly, you can imagine just a million equations. Like, you take a variable, you take a number and you plug it into an equation, and then you take the output of that equation and plug it into another one, take the output of that equation, plug it into another one. Do that millions and millions of times. That's what's happening in machine learning. There's no longer like a single formula or single equation that can like give you the answer to what a machine learning algorithm will give you. Instead, what happens is you split the data into these training and testing sets, right? That's something we didn't do. Before, we just gave it all the data, and there's no like split. But in machine learning, like, because it's about prediction, the reason you do this training and testing split is because the point is you take about 80% of the data, right? And you have the machine learning algorithm learn patterns in that. But then the way that you figure out like whether the patterns that it learned are valid or not is you just don't show it some of the data, right? You take 20% of the data and you just remove it, right? You hide it from the algorithm. So it thinks that this 80% is like all the data, and it just tries to learn patterns within this 80%. And then you evaluate like whether it actually learned good patterns, right? By at the very end, once it has been trained, then you just bring the 20% test data back in and you say, okay, use what you learned about the patterns in that 80% to predict things about this 20%. right? And the better or worse it does on that, that's like how well it learned. Now, the tricky thing is you can't go back and redo things after you've taken the test, after you've evaluated the test set. Like that was one of the hardest things for me as like, you know, computer science major and stuff, was like, I was like, I don't understand. Like, so say, you know, you do your training on the 80%, then you evaluate it on 20%, and then you say like, oh, it did really badly. So let me go back and change my like algorithm settings so that it does better. It turns out like you can't do that because it's like there's an information contamination where information from the test set has now leaked into the training. Meaning, right, like it's kind of hard. You have to go through it in your head a lot. But like, if you think about it, like now, if you went back and tweaked your machine learning algorithm after it already was evaluated on the test set, the machine learning algorithm has actually learned something about the test set, which you do not want. The point is that it should be learning patterns just from the training data so that you can evaluate it on the test data. The point is like, yeah.
So even if we erase the algorithm's memory and then rerun the entire program, we still cannot.
Yeah, it's like a very like weird thing to think about, and like there's a mathematical sense. Like you could, you know, that's why there's all this math if you take like a machine learning class, is actually because you can mathematically show that like, yeah, it doesn't have to do with erasing the memory or anything. It has to do with like the way that you're nudging, you're pushing the algorithm, right? Meaning the algorithm might not know the data, right? You might erase the data out of the memory, and yet you have like pushed the algorithm to say like, no, don't find these patterns, right? And so if you think about it, then the algorithm does know, even though it doesn't know that it knows, but it knows that like, oh, if I find these patterns, that will do badly on the test data. So it knows something about the test data just by you like restricting the patterns that it's allowed to find. That's like the best way I can explain it without math, I think.
Is it kind of like selection bias of a computer?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually an amazing way to think of it. Thank you. Yeah, it's actually exactly like selection bias, because it's like it's selecting certain patterns, but not like randomly. Like you've kind of forced it to select certain patterns so that it'll do really well on the test data, meaning that information from the test data is like secretly going into the patterns that it's finding. Because yeah, if it found certain patterns, you would say, no, bad, go back, find a different pattern, right? And that's because of the test data. And so that leads to something called overfitting. But yeah, if you take a machine learning class, will do like 4 whole weeks on this concept, and I'm trying to do it in like one bullet on one slide. So yeah, but actually, yeah, it's literally, yeah, selection bias for the algorithm is like an amazing way. I might steal that from you when I teach this in the future. Thank you. I'll give you credit. Yeah, in practice, you use scikit-learn, right? You load the data, split it. Like there's a function in scikit-learn called split data, and then you tell it like what percentage. But the default is 80. And then you train the model. And what's going on under the hood here seems so scary, right? Like everything I've said so far makes it seem really scary. Like, oh my gosh, we can't know what's going on under the hood. But I can say like, if we go one level below just like the word train, I think it's helpful to know that hopefully you remember, or like if you were here for that section, there was a point where I was talking about like, oh, in regression, it's just learning a line, right? And a line can be defined by 2 numbers, right? The intercept, how high or low it is, and then the slope, right? How slanted it is. And then I talked about how like for simple linear regression, there's just a simple equation to find the best line. You don't have to try different lines. But in machine learning, that's actually what's happening. Is it's actually just trying different lines, and basically just it tries a line and it sees how well that line fits the data. And if it does well, it says, okay, cool. The final line that I like return as like my pattern that I've found should be something like this. And it might change the slope a little bit, or it might change the height a little bit, right? But if it knows that it's doing really bad, it will change a lot, right? And so that's what's really happening under the hood. When you click train, like you'll do it for this class, you'll do sklearn.train. What's happening is it's just trying different lines, right? So that can hopefully make it a little less mysterious. The line becomes not just lines, but like hyperplanes and stuff when you have multiple variables. So it gets a little hard to visualize above like 3 dimensions, maybe. But yeah, all that's happening is it's trying different like ways of fitting the data and seeing how well it does, and then adjusting those lines or planes over and over and over again until it finds one that it thinks it's good enough. Like it's like, oh, I can't change the slope and I can't change the height to do any better. Like when I change the slope now or change the intercept now, I do worse. That's kind of what's happening under the hood. Cool, so then you ask it to predict the dependent variable values given the independent variable values in the test set, right? That's where like, that's the pattern that you can't contaminate the, I should just say like to make it really concrete, like I worked in a lab at Princeton where like we did an experiment and then we did machine learning on it. And we were like, oh man, it did like so badly. And there's just one parameter that we could change to make it do not so badly, right? But like to have it be a valid experiment, you have to redo the entire thing, meaning you have to collect a whole new set of data. We had to spend more like thousands of dollars to go and do these surveys on people just because we wanted to change one parameter on the machine learning model, right? If we had just said, no, it's fine, like I'll just change the parameter and then redo it, that's not good, right? Because the reason we want to change the parameter is because it did badly on the test set. So yeah, you have to recollect data. You have to do a whole new thing. Cool. Yeah, and then you could be accuracy by comparing predicted values with the actual values. So a lot of the slides I have from now on are just plots or tables of that, what that looks like, right? Actual versus predicted, a table of what that looks like. And what we might find is like, oh, our model isn't doing well at predicting these, right? So like in the zip code digits data set, like there's certain digits that look really similar, right? Like a lot of people write 1 and 7 in a really similar way. So like the Postal Service found, they might find that like, oh, we're doing really badly on differentiating between 1 and 7. And then they might try and, well, one thing they might try to do is like collect a bunch of things, a bunch more 1s and 7s, right? Like maybe they'll do a survey where they'll have like 1,000 people all write 1 and 7 over and over again. And they'll just feed that into the algorithm so it can try and get better and better at differentiating between these, right? So that's like the process of what, why these plots are helpful, because you can say, okay, yeah, I got to fix how my algorithm like does on 8s. You got to go collect new data, but data that you think will help it better, do better on 8 in this case, without doing worse on the other ones. All right, finally, this is what I wanted to get to, and then we're done, which is just like overfitting, right? This from the Wikipedia is just like an example of where it's trying to figure out a line, like a barrier of dividing like blue data from red data points. And like you can imagine here, maybe the x-axis is, well, okay. The x-axis is like age, the y-axis is income, and then the blue means they live in poverty and red means they don't live in poverty, right? So it looks like, the real pattern is this black line. There's some people where it's like, oh, they're outliers, right? Like they don't, like this person, is sort of similar to people who, sort of similar to people who live in poverty in terms of maybe they have a really similar age and income level to like people who are usually well off in that community, but they do live in poverty, right? Whereas this is the opposite. This is a person who has the characteristic of like, for age and income of someone who who usually does live in poverty, but maybe they like, got really lucky, they won the lottery or something, and so they don't live in poverty, right? What's the problem here is like, this is just memorizing those quirks of that data set. Like this person is like a quirk and this person is a quirk, right? They're like outliers from the general pattern of what separates people in poverty from people not. right? And the point is, like, as social scientists or whatever, even as predictors, we want to find like the general pattern. We don't want it to just memorize these things, right? Because then if we try to take this model and go like, say like 10 years from now, let's try to use this model to, you know, figure out like, yeah, the point is we want to be able to generalize from it. Like we want to be able to say, oh, maybe we'll go to another community, but we'll use this to try and predict who's in poverty and who's not, so that we can like intervene. Like maybe we want to just give money to the people who we predict will be impoverished, right? The point is this memorization, this has to do with the quirks of the particular data set, not the general like social pattern, right? And so last slide is just that the way you like detect this, right, is that, so y-axis here is like error, right? So that's how badly we're doing. And it turns out that like, as your model gets more and more complex, as you're like memorizing more and more of these quirks, right, you're obviously going to do better on the training set, right? And that's why you have this test set, right? Because the test set, eventually your model gets too complicated and it starts doing badly because it's just like, wait, no, usually people in here are, you know, they're not in poverty, but you keep predicting that people inside this barrier are in poverty, right? So you actually start to do worse because you're just memorizing quirks about the data set that you fed it, not the general social pattern, right? And that's why the test set error increases after a certain time. It just starts to, the computer starts to see patterns where there aren't actually patterns. And that means that it won't generalize it well. It's like just memorizing specifics of the data, the training data that you gave it, right? And so that's why we do this split, is so that we can figure out where's the point where our test accuracy, right, starts getting worse. That's when you like stop, right? If you stop here in terms of complexity, meaning complexity is like adding more and more variables or finding crazier and crazier lines, right? The line gets more squiggly and weird. That's what's happening as the X value increases here. There's a certain point where you have to stop. You have to say, no, 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 don't make any more like squiggles because you're just memorizing things. And it's, yeah, you can read this article to find out about it. And that's that. That's the last slide. So thanks so much. Sorry for going over.
Sorry, a quick question. So